Alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa ta'ala wa barakatuh. Welcome to this lecture number 9 in literary criticism. My name is Dr. Fawzi Slisley, and I will be talking to you today about structuralism. Not just any structuralism, we will talk a little bit in general about the movement of structuralism in criticism and literary theory, and we will focus for some time on the work of Roland Barthes, one of the most prominent structuralist and post-structuralist critics in the 1960s and 70s. We will focus on one specific theory that he wrote in an essay and which received a lot of attention. It's his theory on the author. He laid down a number of ideas that were very provocative and received a lot of attention. The essay is called The Death of the Author. The Death of the Author. Very provocative. What kind of death of the author is he talking about? Is it literal? Is it figurative? Is it a metaphor? Is it a figure of speech? We will look at these questions in a minute. And before that, I would like to mention that Roland Barthes' theory of the author did not emerge out of nothing. But in a way, you will notice that it is a continuation of the work of Russian formalists. As we have seen in the previous lecture, Russian formalists were the first in the 20th century who tried to systematize the study of literature, to make the literary scholarship an autonomous field that works on, that generates its own methods rather than borrows them from other fields, from psychology or sociology or politics or philosophy. They wanted literary scholarship to become autonomous, to generate its own methods, and to specify its field with precision, because the study of literature was before that not very specific. Traditional criticism looks at literary works in search of sometimes biographical data of the author, sometimes in search of psychological data about the author, sometimes in search of political, social, or philosophical ideas that they extract from the work of literature and they discuss in an attempt to explain the work. So Russian formalism wanted to end this, what they saw as a chaotic tradition, in which the field of literature did not seem to have a specific field of its own. They wanted to specify what is it in literature that makes it literary, and they wanted to specify their methods too, generate their own literary methods for understanding and analyzing literary texts without borrowing from neighboring disciplines. So, as you will see, Roland Barthes' theory of the author continues this tradition, although he is not a formalist, but was more associated with the movement of structuralism and of post-structuralism. But you can see clearly that his ideas are a continuation of the work of Russian formalism. And this is a characteristic that he shares with all the other scholars in structuralism and post-structuralism, and also all other critical or theoretical movements associated with structuralism and post-structuralism. All of them, as we said, owe a great debt to Russian formalism. So, also another important point is that Roland Barthes' ideas about the author that he illustrated in his essay, The Death of the Author, were very provocative and received a fair amount of attention, to the point that in response to Roland Barthes, a number of other ideas developed from other prominent critics. So, for example, Michel Foucault wrote his famous essay in response to Roland Barthes, his famous essay, What is an Author? And the topic of the author became a central and prominent topic in the work of structuralism and post-structuralism and in critical and literary theory of the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. So we are talking today the topic of the author about a central topic in structuralism and post-structuralism. And so these are general ideas that we need to keep in mind before going into the details of Roland Barthes' essay. Let me start first with a few ideas about structuralism. Structuralism usually designates a group of French thinkers who were influenced by Ferdinand de Saussure's theory of language. They were influenced by the development of linguistics through the work of Ferdinand de Saussure, and most of them happened to be in France, and more specifically in Paris, and they became known as French structuralists. They were active in the 1950s and 60s and applied concepts of structural linguistics to the study of social and cultural phenomena, including literature. Structuralism developed first in anthropology, then in literary and cultural studies. It developed first in anthropology with Claude Lévi-Strauss, and then from Lévi-Strauss's work, structuralism expanded into literary and cultural studies with people like Roman Jakobson, Roland Barthes, Gérard Genette. Then in psychoanalysis with the work of Jacques Lacan, it expanded into intellectual history with Michel Foucault, and it expanded into Marxist theory with Louis Althusser. These thinkers never formed a school. They were never part of like a unified school, but it was under the label of structuralism that their work circulated in the 1960s and 70s. In literary studies, structuralism, as we said in previous lectures, is interested in the conventions and the structures of the literary work. They're interested in the work itself, not in the biography of the author, the psychology of the author, the idea of the intuition, all of that. Anything that's outside the text, they're not interested in it. They're interested in how the text generates systems of signification. And they're interested in developing methods to dig out these systems of signification and make sense of them and illustrate them. Structuralism does not seek to produce new interpretations of literary works, but to understand and explain how these works can have the meanings and the effects that they do. It is not easy to distinguish structuralism from semiotics. Semiotics is the general science of signs, which traces its lineage to Ferdinand de Saussure also, but also to the American scholar Charles Sanders Peirce. That's semiotics. The difference, though, there is a slight difference, is that semiotics tries to be as scientific as possible. Semiotics is the general study of signs in behavior and in communication, and it avoids philosophical speculation and cultural critiques which mark structuralism. Structuralism is interested in philosophical speculations and cultural critiques. Semiotics isn't. Semiotics is tries to be a very hard science. There is a systems of science, and they try to illustrate, you know, how they function without going into philosophical or cultural questions beyond that effort. Whereas structuralism is interested in the systems of signification, but also engages in the philosophical and the cultural critiques of those systems of signification. Let's move to Roland Barthes now. He was a prominent structuralism. He was born in 1915 and died in 1980. This presentation will look at his work, especially his essay, The Death of the Author, which was published in his book called Image, Music, Text. Image, Music, Text. It's a book that is essentially a collection of essays, including The Death of the Author. It was translated, it was originally written in French, and it was translated by Stephen Heath in 1977. Barthes starts by telling us that the author, the idea of the author, is a modern invention. And it seems a strange thing to say, that the author is a modern invention. But if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. During the medieval period and the early Renaissance, books circulated a lot of the time without authors. They didn't need to have the name of an author attributed to it to circulate. In fact, some literature some books did not require an author at all, and it was only used, authors were only used for scientific books. Scientific books needed an author, but everything else functioned, circulated in manuscripts, often without authors at all. So the author is a modern figure. It's the idea of being the creator of a work, or being the owner of ideas. The idea of ownership of ideas is a modern phenomenon. The author, says Roland Barthes, is a modern figure, a product of our modern society. It emerged with English empiricism in the period after the Renaissance. It emerged with French rationalism during the Enlightenment, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And it emerged in the personal faith of the Reformation, when society discovered the prestige of the individual. Remember, we said with humanism, there is in the Renaissance, with the movement of humanism, there is a respect for the human, the individual. And the human person starts to become a concept that's endowed with some kind of nobility, being human, right? And the concept of the author emerged in this culture. Literature, since then to the present, says Roland Barthes, literature is tyrannically centered on the author, his life, his person, his tastes, his passion, his genius, and so on. The author functions as a tyrant in the production of literature and in the appreciation and the analysis of literature. What it means basically is that the explanation of a text of literature, when critics study literary texts, what they look for is the person who produced the text. They study Hamlet looking for Shakespeare, right? They study the romantic poetry of Wordsworth, looking for the psychology of Wordsworth, for the person of Wordsworth. So in ethnographic societies, the responsibility of a narrative is never assumed by a person, but by a mediator, a relator. What it means is that in non-Western societies, especially oral societies, the a narrative does not need to have an author. It has a mediator, a narrator, somebody who relates the narrative or the story to the community. But that relator is only a mediator, a relator. He does not have an ownership of that narrative. And the community, to understand the narrative, does not need to understand the person who tells the narrative as an owner, as an author. So this is a distinction between Western societies that have culture and literature based on the idea of the author, and non-Western societies that have narratives, stories, that function without needing an author to be a guarantor of that narrative. So in Western society, Roland Barthes says that the concept of the author and the figure of the author has governed like a tyrant. Literature is read, appreciated, analyzed, taught in reference to the author, the figure of the author, the psychology of the author, the taste of the author, the genius of the author, and so on and so forth. The explanations of the work is always sought in the man or woman who produced it, as if it were always, in the end, through the more or less transparent allegory of the fiction, the voice of a single person, the author confined in us. What Roland Barthes means here is simply that the text is not simply the voice, it's not simply the transparent allegory, the fiction, the voice of a single person. He will explain that a text, a literary text, for example, or a cultural text, is drawn from innumerable, from a multitude of origins. And the author is simply the conveyor who gathers all those traces and ties them up in the text that he produces. So when we focus on the author, we fail to understand those multiple origins of those systems of signification. So because we focus on the author, the figure of the author reigns supreme in histories of literature, in biographies of writers, in interviews, in magazines, as in the mind of the critics who are anxious to unite the work and their authors, or through biographies, diaries, and memoirs. The critics act as guardians of literature. They are the experts. They know more. And how do they know more? Because they are the ones who finally can explain the text by reference to the author. They tell us about the psychology and the figure and the person and the genius and the taste of the person, the author, who produced the text. Literary criticism, as a result, and literature in general, are enslaved to the author. The reader, the critic, the historian, all read the text of literature only to try to discover the author, his life, his personality, his biography, his psychology, etc. The work or the text itself goes unread, unanalyzed, and unappreciated. This is essentially Roland Barthes' general framework, that if we want to understand the text itself on its own, and understand the signifying mechanisms and the signifying processes that the text brings together and generates, we need to look at this function of the author. This function of the author dominates literature in a way that it shouldn't. We should try to get rid of it in a sense, and this is what he means by the death of the author. So Barthes proposes that literature and criticism dispose of the author, get rid of the author, hence the use of the metaphor, the death of the author. He says once the author is removed, the claim to decipher the text becomes quite futile. Nobody will claim to decipher the text. The text can be read, and the text can have a multiplicity of readings, right? And no one can claim that my reading of this text is the most original or the most authoritative. Once there is no text, there is no center to that text, and that text can be understood in so many directions and in so many ways. The professional critics who claim to be the guardians of the text because they are best placed to understand the author's intentions and to explain the text lose their position. All readings become equal. Roland Barthes questions the traditional idea that the meaning of the literary text and the production of the literary text should be traced solely to a single author. Structuralism and post-structuralism proved that meaning is not fixed or located in the author's intentions. A book of literature does not simply contain some intentions that the reader needs to discover. In other words, literature is not a process in which the author comes and hides some intention, some message in a book, and then the reader has to read the book, the story, the novel, the short story, and his job is to discover what those intentions are. This is a narrow understanding of literature. Structuralism and post-structuralism rejected the idea that literature and criticism should rely on a single self-determining author in control of the meaning of the text, and this author would fulfill his intentions and only his intentions, right? It doesn't work like this. A text, a narrative, a novel, a short story, even a poem comes from multiple sources. The author simply puts them together and can have multiple interpretations, multiple readings. And even if the author tries to put some message in this book, there will always be an excess of signification, an excess of words, an excess of meaning. There will always be an extra of meaning that the author will not be able to control. So there is always an extra signification more than what the author intends in a text. So Roland Barthes says if we want to appreciate that excess of signification, that extra meaning, we need to deal with literature beyond the concept of the author, by putting the concept of the author and the function of the author outside the literary criticism. So by doing that, Roland Barthes says we move from considering works of literature as works, the idea of the work of literature. It gives it some solemnity. It's solemn, it's a work, it's a chef-d'oeuvre, right? We dispose of the idea of the work and we create the idea of the text. The work of literature becomes a text, simply a text. It's not a work, it's a text. And a text simply needs to be analyzed, simply needs to be decoded, simply needs to be dealt with as a process of signification. So according to Roland Barthes, it is language that speaks and not the author, because the author cannot determine meaning. Once you put words on paper, you cannot control them. Those words can have multiple meanings, can have an infinity of interpretation and signification. We no longer talk about works, but we talk about texts. And he says he has this famous passage, it became very famous ever since, where he says, it is now known that a text is not a line of words releasing a single theological meaning, the message of the author God, an author that acts like a God. But the text is a multi-dimensional space in which a variety of writings, in the plural, none of them original, blend and clash. The text is a tissue of quotations, citations, drawn from the innumerable centers of culture. So notice this stress on multiplicity in terms of the sources from which the text comes from, and then the multiplicity in the sense that the text is a multiplicity of citations, of quotations, like a patchwork of quotations, and then a multiplicity of interpretations. He says, Roland Barthes says, does he wish to express himself? Meaning, does the author has an idea he wished to express? Then he ought at least to know, the author ought at least to know, that the inner thing, that inner message he has, that he thinks he can translate, is itself only a ready-formed dictionary. If the author thinks that he has a message to say, then the author needs to know that that message is itself a dictionary, a ready-made dictionary. Its words only explainable through other words, and so on indefinitely. So here, Roland Barthes stresses this complex system of signification that happens in literature. And he says that the function of the author blocks this play of signification. It prevents us as critics, as students, as writers, from understanding and appreciating these signification processes. And it's only by removing the author from the process, from the picture, that we can learn to appreciate and understand and study these processes of signification. Also, Barthes wants to move from the text, from the work to the text, but also he says if we get rid of the author, we will also move from the author to the reader. It will be the reader who will become central rather than the author. Roland Barthes wants literature to move away from the idea of the author in order to discover the reader, and more importantly, in order to discover writing, the complex process of writing. A text is not a message of an author. It is a multi-dimensional space where a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash. A text, he says, is made of multiple writings. They are drawn from many cultures and entering into mutual relations of dialogue, parody, contestation, etc. But there is one place where this multiplicity is focused. It's all focused on one place, and that one place is the reader, not the author. So it's the reader, in the end, that makes the text concrete, because it's the reader who deciphers and decodes those linguistic signs, that text, those systems of signification. It's the reader in the end who decodes them and puts them into, gives them a concrete existence by turning them into meaning. In the text, they're only signs. When the reader reads and understands and thinks, the reader turns signs into meaning. In other words, it is the reader, not the author, that should be the focus of interpretation. The process of signification that a text carries is realized concretely at the moment of reading, not at the moment of encoding when the writer is writing. So in that sense, Roland Barthes says that the birth of the reader has a cost, and this cost is the death of the author. The birth of the reader has a cost, and this cost is the death of the author. It's a very important idea that the text is plural for structuralism and post-structuralism, especially for post-structuralism. The text is plural. It's a tissue of quotations, of citations. It's a woven fabric with citations, references, echoes, cultural languages that signify far more than any authorial intentions. It is this plurality that needs to be stressed, and it can only be stressed by eliminating the function of the author and the tyranny of the author from the reading and the analysis process. By eliminating the author, we come to understand the multiplicity of writings that interact to make up the text as a tissue, as a fabric of citations and quotations. Also, Barthes says that once we get rid of the concept of the author and the figure of the author, we discover the figure of the scripter. The writer becomes simply a scripter, someone who puts a script together, a process of signification. A scripter is a technical word. It doesn't have the aura and the importance of an author. An author has something dramatic and all too important about it. He wants to lower the importance of the author and just make him a scripter, someone who puts codes into a text, a script, and the reader has a responsibility to decode that script. The author, when you believe in the author is always conceived as the past of his own work. So the author is the past. He is the consciousness that either went through pain or happiness and produced this text, right? So the author in that sense is always the past of this work. The book and the author in that sense stand automatically on a single line divided into a before and an after, right? The author is the past of his work and the work is the after, right? So author and work stand automatically on a single line divided into a before and after. When we use the concept of the scripter, we get rid of this moment of before and after. Why is that? Because the scripter and the work become concrete together in the process of reading. It's the process of reading, they come together. The concept of the scripter and the work and the text come together at that moment. The author is thought, because the author in traditional criticism is thought to be the before and the text is the after, the author is thought to nourish the book. He is the consciousness that produced the book or the work, which is to say that he exists before the work. He thinks for the book. He suffers for the book. He lives for the book. He is in the same relation of antecedence to his work as a father to a child. The author is the father, the work is the child. But when we get rid of the author and we focus on the reader, and we have, instead of an author, we simply have a scripter, we have a different situation. Roland Barthes says that in complete contrast, the modern scripture is born simultaneously with the text. He is born with the text. He is in no way equipped with the being preceding or exceeding the writing. The scripture is simply a function of the text. Is not the subject with the book as predicate. There is no other time than that of the enunciation, the time of actually uttering those words, the time of making those words be signified, the time of reading those words. And every text is eternally written in the here and now, at the moment it is read. So it's the moment that a text is read that it is really written, because the writing process finishes only with the moment of reading, the moment when the signification process materializes and becomes concrete. So the modern scripture, in a way, Barth uses this image to describe it. He says the modern scripture has his hand cut off from his voice, right? The hand is cut off from his voice, so the hand writes, but there is no voice there to guide it, to give it intentions, to give it a message, to burden it with a message. The hand is free to practice the sign, the very practice of the sign. The modern scripture is born by a pure gesture of inscription, the very practice of the sign. It is not a gesture of expression, it is a gesture of inscription. It traces a field without origin, of which at least has no other origin than language itself, language which ceaselessly calls into question all origins. So succeeding the author, yani after the death of the author, comes the scripture, and the scripture no longer bears within him passions, humors, feelings, impressions, but rather this immense dictionary. The scripture simply brings an immense dictionary from which he draws a writing that can know no stop, it can know no halt. Life never does more than imitate the book, and the book itself is only a tissue of science, an imitation that is lost, indefinitely deferred. Notice that Barth talks in this instance about life imitating the book, rather than the book imitating life. And this brings us to the end of this session. Inshallah, in the next session we will look at Michel Foucault's analysis of the concept of the author. Michel Foucault will criticize Roland Barthes' theory of the author and will present himself a set of new ideas that also received a lot of attention. And with this we come to the end of this lecture. Thank you so much for following. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa ta'ala wa barakatuh.